Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM, channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. World Pride DC festivities wrapped up this weekend here in the nation's capital with thousands of members of the LGBTQ plus community and their allies gathered to celebrate love, diversity, and resilience. Now, tonight, we're reflecting on the parades, the messages, and the challenges that lie ahead. And we're asking, where does the movement go from here as advocates work to ensure their agenda is not just heard, but celebrated louder and prouder? My guests are Victoria Corby York, Director of Public Policy and Programs at the National Black Justice Collective, and Jay Jones, a Black trans woman and alumnus of the Human Rights Campaign's HBCU program. Thank you both for joining this important conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Sure thing. And I wanted to say, the big events kind of wrapped up this weekend, but there are still celebrations and other events that go on through the entire month of June. But I wanted to really start with getting both of you to assess the World Pride festivities over the weekend and the messages of the event. I'll start with you, Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
Victoria, go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were coming with another question. So the festivities were muted from where we believed they were going to be initially, just because of the tone and tenor that our nation has taken since January 20th. When World Pride was first announced as coming to the United States as a part of the 50th anniversary of Capitol Pride, we had just experienced some of the most historic policy wins when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. That also included some wins specifically for Black LGBTQ plus and same gender loving people. And within minutes of the transition, it was stripped away, right? Including funding for HIV care and other kinds of health care in countries around the world. And, World Pride is supposed to be this experience where people from all over the world come to a location, it changes year to year, to really celebrate the diversity of our community. And unfortunately, there were so many countries and so many people who are terrified to come to the United States, which once was a beacon of hope, a light for people, a place that folks came to feel safe. We had a Welcome Corps program under the last administration designed to bring folks who are experiencing criminalization for being gay or trans in places like Uganda and Nigeria, and even Ghana, who's had a bill that they've been debating over. We're looking to come here for refuge. And now we're terrified as people living here that we're moving in the direction of these other countries that once, were the places folks were fleeing from, right? So,
but let me ask you that,
I
do want to get into that, and I have a lot of questions to the things that you were speaking on. But the thing that I wanted to ask you first, and the question related to, what did this weekend mean to you? Your participation in the celebration as a member of this community, as not only personally, but obviously as someone who works in that space. This had, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this had to be an emotional moment of celebration. And talk to me about that, if you could.
On a personal level, it definitely felt like a release and like a reunion, right? And when I say release, I mean, we were carrying this fear about what could happen, right? Mm-hmm. But once we were all together, all of that just kind of faded, and we were filled with the joy of what was actually happening, right? The people we haven't seen in months or years that we had the opportunity to dance with or hug or cry with, to take selfies with, right? The fact that we were able to march together in parades, and also from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where I spoke at the rally yesterday, to the feet of the Capitol, to be able to say with a united voice that we are stronger together. The theme of World Pride this year was the fabric of freedom. And as a Black person whose family comes from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and from Dorchester County, where Harriet Tubman fled, I grew up knowing about freedom quilts and the idea that freedom quilts were tapestries that gave you the instructions for how you could get to freedom, survive freedom, and have the spiritual help and support needed to be able to move in a world that wanted to keep you enslaved, right? And so this idea of this fabric of freedom being the theme was felt really hard for me every time I saw the words on a sign, because it feels very much like we're in a moment now where we have to find unique ways, whether it be in the fabric of our clothes or a quilt, or even how we braid our hair, right? As was done back in the day, right? How do we ensure that people are prepared for the moment that we find ourselves in? How do we ensure that our folks have the tools to get to and maintain freedom? Because we still have way too many people, especially Black trans women like my sister Jay, who have to deal with insane amounts of violence that shouldn't be tolerated in this country, but too often is. And so we're still plotting towards freedom for all of our people. And so when I sat and looked at just the many different faces in the crowd yesterday, that was something that really hit me as the rain was falling on our shoulders and starting to cause an effect on each of us individually. I had my own kind of feelings and emotions that was just sitting with me on what we all needed to do to get through this moment together, and how beautiful it was that we were literally in the moment together, fighting to ensure that we aren't splintered or dismantled as a community, that we remember that our force and our power is at its strongest when we're united and don't allow others to break us into segments.
Jay, same question. Obviously, I know you were working, but on a personal level, and I think this is really important for our listeners to understand the feeling that this weekend brought for you.
Yeah, I think it was two feelings, and I've been kind of saying this, that you can two things can be true at the same time. I think that we can find community and we can find joy and we can find love, but at the same time acknowledge the essentially turmoil that's happening all the way around us. And I think that was one of the things that happened this weekend. It was we were walking our gum, and we were walking while chewing gum at the same time. In a world in which, for me especially, I think that we've seen consistent and constant attacks specifically on trans people and people of the entire gender nonconforming community, all the way from the current United States Supreme Court that's literally being decided in a matter of days with Scarametti. What we're seeing, right, is that Pride also became a moment of refreshment for all of us. Similar to what my sister Victoria was saying, right, that it really is a very much a reunion. I've been able to see people who I didn't get to see regularly. I remember seeing some of my partners at HRC, some of my partners at the LGBTQ task force, people who I genuinely don't see in community that much, and to see them, it's almost a good refreshing moment for us. But I think that on that same foot and on that same tone, it's also important for us to be reminded, right, that Pride was a protest. And I think that was the consistent talking point that we noticed throughout the entire week, is that Pride originally was a protest. Pride, I heard about 10 different times. Pride was a protest, Pride was a protest, Pride was a protest. And in the spirit of protesting, I think it's important to note that this is a time where we saw, while it may not have been directly related to Pride, we've been seeing protests all throughout the country. I mean, I remember when we were on Sunday, as we were there on Sunday, we were all talking about the things that were going on in California. As Donald Trump was calling in the National Guard, right? That's the spirit of Pride. The spirit of Pride is while yes, a celebration and a reunion, it's a protest. And even being able to see schools like my alma mater, Howard University, being able to march on Saturday in the entire Pride march was very monumental, especially for me. And so I think two things to be true at the same time. I enjoyed Pride. I got to enjoy it with my community, and I got to enjoy it with the people who I love. But on the same foot, I definitely think that there's a lot more work that we have to do, and we have to come up with a better plan, a better strategy for the next 4 years that Donald Trump is going to be in the White House.
Jay, as you know, you too, Victoria, but I'll start with Jay here, and we may have to continue after the break. But as you know, there was a lot of back and forth about whether DuPont Circle Park would be closed off. Ultimately, it was cordoned off. As you know, there were incidents of violence. And there, of course, was a press conference today where the chief of police in DC said, the reality is that, there were some outside agitators and the like. Your thoughts about the hubbub around DuPont Circle Park, Jay?
Well, I think it's a bigger problem and a bigger conversation that we need to have, right? That extends far beyond DuPont Circle, right? When we were talking about, I think when even there was the conversations around World Pride being at DC and World Pride being here in the nation's capital, I think there was a lot of conversation that had to be had between all of these different offices, of course, between the DC's office, between the federal government, all of these different groups. I think, of course, my original thought when I did hear that DuPont Circle was going to be closed and shut down was of course, I think like a spirit of okay, I know that this is typically a place where we all will coordinate. There's historical roots that exist within DuPont Circle as it relates to Capitol Pride, and it was a sad reality that I think that was setting us up for these next, not necessarily 4 years, 4 years, but it's a sad reality that how we do things and how we have pride is having to shift and having to change because of outside agitators, because of this inflammatory language that's being utilized and used, that's coming out the White House, that's coming out the House of Representatives, that's coming out by both the RNC, and I'll blame the DNC while I'm here, right? It is this inflammatory language that is essentially inflaming people to feel this way and to have this sort of feeling of resistance and opposition to gender nonconforming people, to trans people, to LGBTQ plus people, that things are having to be utilized and changed. I remember I was just on U Street this past weekend as well, and how even U Street had to be organized. I saw there was a news report that had came out where, due to some other outside agitators, there was I believe 3 people were hurt at the U Street station later that evening. And so how things are changing are shifting because of all of this inflammatory language that's consistently being used. And I want to make sure I talk about that, right? Language is important and it's dangerous, right? I grew up in a very biblical home, right, where personally, right, we had the very firm belief that, right, the power of the tongue has the power over life and over death. And I think it's important to note that, right, the language that elected officials, not even just elected officials, but I'll take it a step further, right, which is people who are also have platforms, period, they have a due diligence to ensure that they are using language that is not only just protective, but also language that is respectable and language that is not weaponizing. And what we're noticing is people are intentionally using language to ensure violence, to ensure frustration, and to ensure harm, so that people, right, so that when we are now having moments of celebration like this, we have to now rethink and reconvene how we are setting up these areas when it's coming down to DuPont Circle, but also, right, U Street and other areas where we know there are going to be large crowds of LGBTQ plus people.
I need you to hold that point because I also want Victoria to answer that question, but I need to take a break. And we want to remind our listeners not to forget that you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on our website, WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation tonight about this past weekend's World Pride DC celebrations and challenges. And we're asking tonight, where does the movement go from here? My guests are Victoria Kirby York, Director of Public Policy and Programs at the National Black Justice Collective, and Jay Jones, a Black trans woman and an alumnus of the Human Rights Campaign's HBCU program. Before the break, Victoria, I was asking Jay about the weekend events, and particularly as it relates to closing DuPont Circle. Do you believe that in first reports of closing and then cordoning off may have drawn more attention to the issue as opposed to just leaving it alone and just leaving it open and just letting people celebrate as they normally would?
I don't think that I think anyone who wanted to cause a problem over World Pride weekend was going to try to cause a problem over World Pride weekend, right? And DuPont Circle is the historic community for the LGBTQ community in DC. Although to Jay's point about U Street, I would argue that today's LGBTQ community is much more focused, right outside of Howard, right, on the former Black Broadway.
Why do you say that?
LGBTQ. Well, just because, for one, DuPont has priced out most of us, right? So, back in the day, we could afford to live there, but I don't know, Black LGBTQ people were affording to live there. But, there were LGBTQ people who could live in the neighborhood. Then you used to have Lambda Rising, the LGBT bookstore was there. HRC had its store there. There were tons of nightclubs, gay clubs that were all, right outside the circle. Whereas now a lot more of the clubs that especially younger queer, trans, and gender expansive people go to are in the U Street area, right? Thirst Lounge, a Black LGBTQ owned and operated bar is, right alongside U Street, right? So that's where you've got the sports bar, Nelly Sports Bar, and so many other businesses that are alongside that corridor. And I'm a stereotypical lesbian, so I got married and don't really go out that much. But I know
I think that's just a stereotypical married person, no matter
in general,
what. Right?
Maybe so.
You can be lesbian, you can be straight. It's like, where are you going? You're not going out tonight.
We just U-Haul up out of everywhere. But my friends who still get out there, I can't think of the last time any of my friends or the young people I work with have said, "Oh yeah, let's meet up at DuPont." They meet up along U Street. But having been at the festival grounds the last 2 days, it was heavily secured, right? Like there were law enforcement from all different kinds of agencies around the area, from Virginia, Maryland, MPD, federal folks, making sure that all of the entrances to the area were protected. I mean, they even had large trucks blocking off the roads so that nobody could do what they did in New Orleans, New Year's Day, to just try to drive through the crowd, right?
Right.
And so they were able to do that because of the way those roads are set up. They couldn't easily do that in DuPont, right? In terms of how that area was, they wouldn't have been able to protect people en masse in that same way as easily. And so I understand the decision to close it down. Although, symbolically, I get it. It would have been great for folks to be able to turn up and party there. But the person who, especially as a mother, whose child, was with me all weekend, I felt pretty safe, where I was. I don't know how safe I would have felt if they weren't able to assure me that the same level of protection was being given there.
Which brings me to my next question, and your comment is a perfect segue. There are, many reports of hate incidents targeting, LGBTQ plus community members. Jay, how do you feel about the rise of these crimes, and what do you think can be done to perhaps address these bad acts? And let me give you some even greater context. Years ago, and this was, probably, don't hold me to the timeline, but this was more than 10 years ago. Former DC Police Chief Kathy Lanier received a lot of criticism about not addressing issues of hate-related violence in the LGBTQ plus community, although she did establish, if I'm not mistaken, the first segment within the police department to address that issue. You have been here and you have watched the evolution in DC of these issues. So is it, from your perspective, is it better? Is it worse? How do you think it should be addressed? Jay?
Well, I think right when we're having a conversation here in DC, I think, and I think that's always important that I always talk about I think the certain level of privilege I think I've been able to experience being on Howard University's campus, right? Being a collegiate student, I think there's a completely set of removal from the broader DC community. I think that I've been able to be privileged enough to be able to experience here in the District of Columbia that I don't know if I would have gotten the same kind of experience had I not been here in where I was at Howard University. I would definitely say, I think that for me, here in DC, and I'm going to speak from a personal level.
Right.
I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody else, but I think that for me, I think that there has been definitely, right, a certain degree and levels of tolerance that have most certainly increased here within the district, right? Even when we're looking specifically at specifically for my experience, there was a time, I remember I always speak to former Howard University alum, there was a time where you couldn't walk down U Street or you couldn't walk down Georgia Avenue by yourself, right? You used to have to walk in pairs of 2s and 3s, and right, you had to walk with someone else, and someone had to make sure, oh, you need to make sure you have this side of the bag, don't walk down this street. We used to have, when I was here my freshman year, we used to have entire language to describe how we need to be interacting with the District of Columbia as it's relating down to safety and as it's relating down to that bigger conversation. And so I definitely can say, I think to the extent, right, that safety has improved and that safety has increased. While once again, on that same point I just made, right, two things can be true on the same foot, right, that I can acknowledge that safety has improved and safety has increased here for specific communities, but I can also acknowledge, right, similar to what I was just saying, right, inflammatory language also has the ability to make all of those strides that were just taken decrease and become practically nonetheless. I think one of the things that we've noticed is right, I'll use Black trans women specifically, but we've noticed the attacks on Black trans women have increased, right? That is a fact. That is a statistic, right? Ever since that we have seen Donald Trump come back into the White House, we have noticed attacks against Black trans women increase around the United States, and that we all have a due diligence, not only just to call that out, right, but to say that attacks against not just specifically the LGBTQ plus community, right? Because I want to make sure I single it out, that it's specifically, there's a specific large disproportionate amount of attacks against Black women of the trans experience in the United States, and that not only just here in the district, but around the world, do we have a due diligence to ensure the protection, but also the security. And I think that it was great, right, that the former police chief had initiated and took those steps to be able to increase the amount of visibility and the amount of offices that she's getting to have work within the specific local community. I love that, but I think it's also a broader conversation, right? It's a broader conversation because we've noticed that the amount of violence is oftentimes linked to other external factors, right? What are we doing to increase housing for people of the LGBTQIA community, right? What are we doing to increase education, right? Because we also can see that, right? That typically Black women or Black women of trans experience who are of quote unquote higher socioeconomic status are least and less likely to engage or to have violence against them in their lives, right? So what are we doing to increase these other external factors to assist in decreasing the overall amount of violence that we're experiencing and that we're seeing for LGBTQIA people?
So what do you think, Victoria? Because when I was talking to Jay about that issue, and I mentioned former DC Police Chief Kathy Lanier, you remember when she was here.
Yeah.
You remember the criticism. Some would argue it was more terse than it needed to be. Others would argue that it was spot on. But compared to that time when you had a police department that was openly recognizing that there was a problem, to now in 2025, are things better? Are they worse? Do you think they haven't changed? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, we used to call it glue. I know they had a name change, but it was initially called the Gay and Lesbian Liaison Unit.
Yes.
To initially function as a group of officers that their main job was to patrol around DuPont Circle and to make sure that the LGBTQ spaces had coverage and people who could respond and with inclusive language. And my understanding, having served I was the vice chair of the mayor's LGBT advisory commission for her first 2 terms. And kind of seeing some of those presentations, I know they shifted to not just be kind of their own thing over here to having officers spread throughout the different parts of the agency, and that they do different kind of train the trainers around LGBTQ inclusion, which I think was smart because it allows folks, no matter what part of the city they're in, to be able to respond without dead naming people, ensuring that the correct pronouns are being used. Those are all things that help not just be respectful, but if you're solving a crime, to close it, to hold someone accountable, to ensure that nobody else does that crime again, because you saw what happened the last time somebody tried that ish. You want to make sure that you're using those right terms. That's how you solve the crime. You can't go to a bar looking for saying you're looking for evidence about something that happened to John Smith and the person was Jane Smith and look like this, right? But you're giving them a picture and they look like that, right? I was visually showing the other sides of my hand for your listeners as examples to, if you want to get the right answers to the questions that you're asking your investigation, you have to be describing the person as they were, right? And as they lived, and glue is doing that.
You mentioned the term dead naming. I'm not familiar with that. What does that mean?
Great question. So dead naming is using the name that a person was assigned when they were born. So I like to use Harriet Tubman as an example, right? She was not born Harriet Tubman. That's the name she chose, right? She was born Emma Ross, right? So, sometimes when investigating the deaths of transgender people, they will use the name a person was born with instead of the name they actually use today. So when doing an investigation, you use a name that person hasn't used in decades. Of course, the case is going to go cold. Of course, you're not going to solve that case because you're not using the name that people actually knew that person as. So
we started this conversation and I stopped you, but I promised that we would get back to it. And so I want to ask you more in depth, Victoria, about what you believe are the most pressing threats to the LGBTQ plus community, their rights, especially under the current political climate?
I think the biggest threat to the LGBTQ community is the same as the biggest threat to the Black community and the immigrant community and other marginalized groups. And that threat is people who should be remaining firm and pushing for our rights and protections going silent because of fear, or worse, or just as bad, fracturing into little groups where one group of people is looking out for themselves and not looking out for other parts of the community. We've seen some, lesbian, gay, same gender loving people who've said, well, the trans community is over there. We can't afford to do that. We have to all remain together. We've seen some Black folks who've said, well, we got to worry about this one component, right? We can't worry about what's happening to Black immigrants who are being disappeared in the middle of the night and taken from their families, right? Or Black LGBTQ plus people who, are being hunted down in the streets, as we saw over the weekend, right? We can't have folks turning blind eyes to what we're seeing, because just like the old saying goes, they might come for me today, but they're coming for you tonight, right? So we've got to make sure that we don't allow any entities to separate and to divide us, because the heart of our power is in what we're able to do collectively, is what we're able to do to push back. There have been plans that this administration and others have had to cause even greater harm that they stopped, decided not to do, took the draft executive order and put that thing in the trash, because enough of us galvanized to say, we're not tolerating that as a people. And it was enough of a threat because people from all political backgrounds, whether they were Democrat, Republican, independent, whether they were a person of color or white, LGBTQ plus, or straight and cisgender, decided enough is enough. And we have to continue to doing that. It can't just be a flash in the pan. We have to continue coming together and saying enough is enough. We have to continue to ensure that it becomes not only political harm to those in power to continue to cause harm to marginalized communities like ours. We have to make it a harm to their own economic futures. It has to be a liability for the things that they hold dear, right? And so the only way we do that is by constantly showing up and not giving in to the fear or the attempts to silence us. Because as Audre Lorde says, if you are quiet about your pain, they're gonna tell everybody that you enjoyed it. There's nothing enjoyable about what we're going through right now. And quiet as it's kept, it's not helpful to marginalized people, but it's also not helpful for folks in the majority. And they're starting to see that now too. And we need more and more of them to speak up about how this stuff is impacting their day-to-day lives too.
So Jay, I have a really important question for you as the youngest person in this room. As you know, when you look at civil rights organizations during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was kind of a break between some of the legacy organizations such as LCLC and NAACP and Black Lives Matter. Okay. As a young person in this movement, do you believe that there is the same kind of situation with the legacy LGBTQ plus organizations and the Jay Jones, the young whippersnapper folk?
LOL. I think it's funny that you mentioned that because I'm so used to being the youngest person in the room. So when I was at Howard, I was our Student Government Association over at Howard University Student Association executive president, and being our first ever woman of any HBCU to hold that position of trans experience. it means you're oftentimes the youngest person in the room. And typically, you're the most vocal person in the room because a lot of times, right, when we're talking about younger groups and younger organizations, people do try to silence that. They do try to silence that. And so I think it's so important, I think, to name the moments that the parallels that are being drawn. So I think it was funny that you started with the Black organization specifically, right? The Black Lives Matter, but also, right, when we're comparing sometimes those against like the NAACPs, right? There was someone who has said a quote, I forgot who it is, I'm blanking on who said it, but it's always been young people who've been the drivers of change, right? I think sometimes there's a conversation that happens, or sometimes there's a conversation around change and who has the obligation to bring it. And I think that we have gotten into a point or a perspective where even when you look throughout history, change has never relied or laid on the shoulders of old people, because old people have typically gotten to that place or in that position by staying where they are in a place of complacency. And I think it's important to note that, because I am a very firm believer that, right, there are two sides to change. There's change on the inside, change on the outside, right? And typically for change to happen on the inside, right, we do have to have a lot more of those experienced people in those positions. A lot more times it has to be those people who served in those positions for years and years, the people who had to take the racial slurs, who had to take the rah, 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 and all of these things. I think it's important to note that, but also pay homage and respect to those people. But on the same front, you should never expect someone like no tea, no shade to Cory Booker. I love Cory Booker. Don't get me wrong, yeah, I love Cory Booker. But you should never expect a Cory Booker to go in there saying, I'm going to burn down the same house that I work in, right? You should never expect somebody like that to say that, because there is a certain level of establishment that they have to ensure that they keep in order for certain levels of change to happen. And so I think that's why I say, right, for change sometimes to happen and for us to have those conversations when we're talking about, right, young people, and some people saying, oh, well, Generation Z, or I don't even know what generation I'm in at this point. Generation Z is taking it 5 steps too far, right? And taking it 5 steps or taking it 10 steps out the way, right? I think it's important to note that, right, that the Generation Z that they're calling out was once the Malcolm X, that was once the Martin Luther King, that was once the Kwame Detours of the world, that was once the people who were saying, let's go all the way to step 10, even if we only make it to step 5, right? Because someone has to say, let's go all the way out here for this crazy idea. There's this crazy idea. It was this crazy idea of let's have integration for all schools. It was a crazy idea, one that young people were driving. And for us to get there took, well, we're still trying to get there, but for us to get there to a good extent, right, it took young people having to say this very, very wild, crazy idea, and us having something to work to every single day. And I think that's sometimes the role that young people have to play, is that we do play there's this crazy idea, oh my gosh, it's called protection and equality for all trans people. And because it's that crazy of an idea, we are going to all see that it is an idea, but that organizations like Black Lives Matter, NAACP, both are going to try and make strides to be able to get to that. And so organizations like the HRCs and the GLADs are going to make those strides to try and get to this equality and protection of all trans people, right? But they're going to do so in a completely different way than like an organization like MBJC that's going to take a lot more strides or different strides to be able to get there collectively.
Victoria, what do you think is the motivating or even galvanizing factor in this space and time for the entire, LGBTQ plus community? Because I know, and I'm sure this is probably still one of the inside baseball conversations where Black gay folks and white gay folks don't see eye to eye, because racism, no matter what your gender orientation happens to be, is still an issue. Prejudice and ignorance. What do you think is needed now to bring the entire community together? Does it mean a common enemy or adversary, such as a Trump administration policies, or what?
Yes, we're in an interesting moment in the LGBTQ movement because, recently a significant number of the traditionally white mainstream national organizations are led by Black people, particularly Black women. And so those conversations have been going, it's been different because in the past, our CEO, Dr. David Johns, was
Mhm.
one of the only Black, CEOs there. It's like him and Nadine Smith from Equality, Florida, right? who's been the CEO there for a long time. And all these national mainstream groups have been led by white people. And so right now, there's, half a dozen, the leader of the Human Rights Campaign, the Task Force, GLSEN, the Trevor Project, and I know I'm missing somebody,
Sure.
are all Black women right now. And so that has changed some of the conversations that we've had. When you have that change in leadership at the top, it doesn't mean that the racism present in the movement has disappeared, right? But it means that there's someone at the top of these organizations that are prioritizing the conversations in a different way. It's why we are partnering with many of those organizations and many others for our second annual Equity Week this week here in Washington, D.C. from June 11th through 14th. We're kicking it off Wednesday night with the opening reception with karaoke afterward. That's an opportunity to build fellowship across lines of difference. All are welcome. So although our organization centers Black LGBTQ plus people and will be this week with our public policies, we believe that this moment calls for all of us coming together to fight for all of us. And this is a great opportunity to do that. On Thursday, we're going to be on the Hill with our Out on the Hill program, meeting with members of Congress about fighting for equity and reparations, and to do it with their chest out, 10 toes down, right? Like, don't be quiet about it, right? Again, that silence isn't going to protect us. We need folks combating and saying what equity means, that it's about making this country a hospitable place for all of us, where all of us have the same access and rights to everything anybody else has. That's simply what it is. It's not what somebody else, with some power, I'm not going to call his name, is redefining it to mean. It simply means what it means. And so we're going to be talking to members of Congress about why it's important for them to be loud and proud and to give real good examples, like Representative Clyburn did recently during the FAA conversation around this upcoming budget fight, talking about the examples of when diversity has made us stronger, and not just to be politically correct, but because it was necessary in the moment. It's how you grow your numbers of people who are in these pivotal roles. We've been seeing nothing but planes falling from the sky since they decided to cut people for the sake of DEI. And that's cost real lives, right? And so, we're going to be talking to members of Congress about that. We're also going to have a little fun at the Howard Theater for our equity ball. There's going to be some amazing categories. Folks can win money, $1,500 in the open to all category for your best Statue of Liberty. Give Beyonce's Statue of Liberty a little run for her money, right? And you can get some money of your own. And then Friday, we're going back to what I call the Blacksonian. My boss calls our museum, the African American Museum of History and Culture, where we'll have a commemorative gathering in honor of Bayard Rustin, but also as a place to give us our own spiritual salvo in this time, and to make sure that we're all recommitting to what is necessary in this fight, which is that we lean more deeply into each other, that we honor and respect our history as we move forward to protect our culture and our people.
I think that's a good place to end this.
Oh, and folks can go to nbjc.org. I'm so sorry. You can go to
what's that again? nbjc.org.
nbjc.org to get more information and to register for your tickets. Everything's free except for the equity ball. And we would love for WHUR's listeners to join us.
Well, I'll make sure that I post that when this is posted on our website on WHUR.com this evening around 7 o'clock. Victoria Kirby York, Jay Jones, thank you so much. Jay, again, congratulations on graduation.
Congratulations.
And doing your thing as a young person. Make some money and make your voice heard. Thank you so much. So, that is the Daily Drum for this Monday, June 9th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.